At 71, Evelyn Whitaker never imagined she would beg for water outside her own home. The Homeowners Association had shut off her parents' line, chained their gate, and posted armed guards beside a red eviction notice. Association President Darlene Voss stood smiling on the sidewalk while Evelyn's husband hauled bottled water from his truck to the fence. What Darlene did not know was that their only son was already driving toward Silver Creek, and she assumed he was just another government worker from Washington. 20 minutes later, black federal vehicles surrounded association headquarters, and the man who kicked open the conference room door was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The morning at Silver Creek Estates began with the whine of a power drill and the clang of metal against metal outside the home of Warren and Evelyn Whitaker. Evelyn stepped onto the porch in her robe and found 3 maintenance workers crouched over the main water valve that fed into their property, wrenches in hand, working with the calm efficiency of men who had done this before. She asked to see a county order authorizing the shutoff, and none of the men could produce one. Instead, they handed her a single printed sheet bearing the association's gold-embossed logo with 3 words stamped across the bottom in red ink: service suspended, property, non-compliance. Within minutes, Darlene Voss arrived in a gleaming black sport utility vehicle, stepping out with the satisfied posture of a woman who had rehearsed this moment more than once. She informed Evelyn that the Whitakers owed the association more than $28,000 in landscaping fines, legal fees, and something Darlene called an infrastructure usage charge, a phrase Evelyn had never heard in 40 years of living on that land. Warren came out to the porch the moment he heard raised voices, and he immediately challenged the claim. Their home had been built decades before the association even existed, and the water line running to their property sat on a private easement registered with the county long before Silver Creek was ever platted as a subdivision. Darlene answered smoothly that the association controlled every pipe that crossed within the community boundary, regardless of when it was installed. And Warren recognized the lie the instant it left her mouth, because he had spent 30 years as the county's chief water systems engineer and had personally signed off on that very easement. But Darlene was not finished, and she was not interested in an argument about engineering records. She nodded to her head of private security, a broad-shouldered man named Travis Boone, and he ordered his crew to install an electronic lock across the Whitakers' front gate while the family was still standing in their own driveway. Evelyn had stepped out to the mailbox to retrieve a bottle of blood pressure medication left in the car, and when she turned back toward the house, the gate had already sealed shut behind the new mechanism. She was locked outside her own property, standing on a public sidewalk in her housecoat, while men in matching polo shirts watched without expression. She demanded that Travis open the gate immediately, and he told her flatly that this was an association order, and that no one would be permitted entry until the outstanding balance was paid in full. Darlene stood a few feet behind him, arms folded, and said that perhaps this inconvenience would finally motivate the family to cooperate. Warren rushed to the gate from the inside and found he could not release the lock from his side either, so husband and wife were reduced to speaking through the iron bars, while a neighbor across the street quietly filmed the entire exchange. On her phone, Darlene noticed the camera almost immediately and sent a security guard to demand the footage be deleted, which the neighbor refused to do, backing slowly into her own garage as the guard advanced. What had begun as a disputed fine was now curdling into something closer to unlawful confinement, though nobody standing on that street used those words out loud. Other residents began stepping onto their porches to watch, drawn by the flashing amber lights on the maintenance trucks, and a few pulled out their own phones to record from a careful distance, unwilling to intervene directly but unwilling to look away either. Warren tried once more to reason with Darlene, reminding her that she was a witness to an elderly woman being denied entry to her own residence in broad daylight. But Darlene simply repeated that rules were rules, and that the association could not be expected to make exceptions for people who refused to pay what they owed. Evelyn did not call the police first, and she did not call a lawyer. With her hands trembling against the cold iron of the gate, she dialed the only number she trusted completely: the private cell phone of her son, a man 3 states away who had no idea that his mother was about to be locked outside her own front door. Graham Whitaker was seated at the head of a long conference table in Washington when his personal phone buzzed against the polished wood, and he recognized his mother's number instantly because Evelyn almost never called during business hours. He excused himself from the room and stepped into the hallway, and the entire exchange lasted only 47 seconds, though it would echo through the rest of his day. Evelyn tried to sound composed, telling him the association was having a small disagreement about the water line, and that he shouldn't worry himself over it. Graham asked where she was standing, and when she answered that she was outside the front gate, his tone shifted immediately from casual to precise. He asked who had ordered the lock installed, whether there was a court order behind the shutoff, whether the county utility board had been involved, and whether law enforcement had been called to the scene. Evelyn answered no to every question, and Graham told her to record everything on her phone, but to avoid confronting anyone directly, and above all, not to raise her voice or give the security team any excuse to escalate further. He called his father next, and Warren tried to minimize the situation, insisting this was a homeowner's dispute that the family could resolve without outside interference because he did not want his son pulling federal weight into a neighborhood squabble. Graham told him plainly that he had no intention of using his position to settle a family disagreement, but he paused before adding a second sentence that changed the entire shape of the conversation. If the people responsible had broken federal law, he said, then this stopped being a family matter the moment they made that choice, not the moment he walked through the door. Warren fell quiet on the other end of the line, unaccustomed to hearing his son speak with such measured certainty, and for a moment neither man said anything at all, the silence carrying more weight than any argument could have. Graham finally told him to sit tight to keep Evelyn calm, and to avoid signing anything the association pushed in front of him no matter how reasonable it sounded. While still standing in the hallway, Graham pulled up the county's public land records on his phone, searching for anything unusual attached to Silver Creek Estates, and one detail immediately caught his attention. In the past 2 years alone, the association had filed 37 liens against homeowner properties within the community, an extraordinarily high number for a subdivision of its size, and 11 of those homes had subsequently been sold under distressed conditions at prices well below market value. The same limited liability company appeared as the buyer or the financing partner in nearly every one of those transactions registered under the name Voss Property Holdings. Graham recognized the surname immediately, though he said nothing to his father, yet choosing instead to gather facts before drawing conclusions. He placed a call to Special Agent Nora Bellamy, a colleague he trusted with the kind of quiet inquiries that required discretion rather than drama, and he asked her to check whether Silver Creek Estates had ever appeared in any federal fraud complaints. 10 minutes later, she called back with an answer that confirmed his instinct. 3 separate complaints existed in the system, 2 of them involving elderly residents claiming coercive foreclosure tactics, and 1 involving allegations of forged banking signatures on a property transfer. Graham left the meeting. He had been running boarded a plane within the hour, and by the time he landed he was no longer thinking of himself as a worried son driving home to help his parents, but as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who had just recognized the outline of a criminal pattern. During the flight, he made 2 more calls, one to his deputy to formally flag the matter and request that any eventual investigation be run through proper channels, rather than through him personally, and a second to a former colleague now working in the local field office asking quietly whether Silver Creek Estates had ever crossed anyone's desk before. Neither call was rushed, and neither carried the tone of a man seeking revenge, only the steady procedural caution of someone who understood exactly how easily power could be misused if it wasn't handled correctly. By the time the wheels touched down, he had already decided that whatever happened next would be built on evidence, not anger, even if anger was quietly exactly what he felt. While Graham was still in the air, the true purpose behind the water shutoff finally revealed itself at the Whitaker property. Darlene returned that afternoon accompanied by Marissa Klein, the association's staff attorney, and this time she came bearing what she called a generous offer. If Warren and Evelyn agreed to sign over a 14-acre strip of land along the western edge of their farm, the association would restore water service, immediately erase the entire fine balance, and remove the lock from the gate before nightfall. Warren understood the moment the words left her mouth exactly what this had been about from the very beginning, because that particular strip of land happened to be the only viable access route connecting Silver Creek to a parcel a private developer was hoping to transform into a luxury resort. Securing that easement through the Whitaker property would send the value of the development soaring by millions of dollars, and Darlene stood to benefit from every dollar of that increase. Warren told her flatly that this had never been about a broken water valve at all, and Darlene only smiled and replied that it was simply about being a good neighbor. From the far side of the gate, Evelyn shouted back that stealing land from an elderly couple through intimidation was not what good neighbors did, and Darlene, without turning to look at her, instructed Travis to remove her from the association's common area. Travis reached through the gate and closed his hand around Evelyn's wrist, and that single decision became the biggest mistake of his career, because at that exact moment, a county patrol vehicle rolled to a stop at the curb, and Sheriff Caleb Mercer stepped out, demanding that Travis release her immediately. Darlene insisted that Evelyn had been trespassing on association-controlled property, but when Caleb checked the boundary lines on his own department map, the sidewalk where Evelyn had been standing belonged to county right-of-way, not to Silver Creek at all. He warned Darlene directly that her security staff had no lawful authority to detain a resident under any circumstance, and Darlene, entirely unbothered, reminded him that Silver Creek contributed a significant amount of tax revenue to the county and suggested he think carefully before choosing sides in this dispute. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, the kind of stare that usually made people reconsider what they had just said, but Darlene did not flinch, and that more than anything told him she had made threats like this one before and never once faced a consequence for it. He escorted Evelyn back inside the property line himself, waited until the gate was manually released by Warren, and told Darlene plainly that he would be filing an incident report regardless of how she felt about it. That single sentence, delivered with such casual confidence, planted a seed of suspicion in Caleb's mind that this was no longer a simple property disagreement between neighbors, but something considerably larger operating just beneath the surface of a gated community that had always seemed, at least from the outside, entirely ordinary. Later that same afternoon, 3 black sport utility vehicles turned onto the main boulevard of Silver Creek Estates, moving without sirens, without flashing lights, without any outward sign of urgency at all. Graham sat in the lead vehicle wearing a plain white shirt and a dark blazer, looking less like a man seeking confrontation and more like someone arriving to settle a quiet piece of unfinished business. Inside the association clubhouse, Darlene was in the middle of an emergency board meeting, boasting to the assembled members that the Whitaker family would have papers signed within 48 hours, because in her experience, elderly homeowners rarely had the stamina to fight for long. A board member asked what would happen if the family brought in a lawyer, and Darlene answered without hesitation that older people simply did not have the fight left in them for a prolonged legal battle. An assistant burst into the meeting a moment later to announce that someone was asking to see her, and when Darlene asked who the assistant, answered that it was Graham Boundary. Darlene knew the name from the file, but had only ever seen his occupation listed vaguely as Federal Employee, Washington District of Columbia, and she laughed under her breath, telling the assistant to send him in immediately, certain she was about to enjoy humiliating him in front of the full board. Graham requested a private conversation, but Darlene refused, wanting witnesses present so she could turn him into a spectacle, and she announced loudly that if he had come demanding water restoration for his mother, he was welcome to simply pay the outstanding invoice like everyone else. Graham set the shut-off notice on the table in front of her without raising his voice, and asked whether she had signed the order herself, and she confirmed that she had. He asked whether she had personally directed the gate to be locked, and again she confirmed it. He asked whether her security staff had been instructed to keep his mother outside the property, and for the first time Darlene hesitated, sensing that the conversation had quietly shifted into something closer to an interrogation than an argument. She demanded to know exactly who he thought he was, and Graham reached into his jacket, produced his credentials without any theatrical flourish, and simply set them on the table beside the notice for everyone in the room to see clearly. The badge read Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the room fell into a silence so complete that the ceiling fan overhead seemed suddenly loud. One board member rose halfway out of his chair. Travis, standing near the back wall, went visibly pale. Marissa stared at Darlene with an expression that mixed disbelief with the sudden dawning realization that she might have spent the past several years defending someone far more dangerous than she had understood. Darlene finally managed to say that he could not use the Bureau to settle a personal family matter, and Graham agreed with her completely, telling her that was precisely why he had not come there for his family at all. He placed a second folder on the table, thicker than the first, and told her plainly that federal investigators had been reviewing Silver Creek Estates for reasons that had nothing to do with one water valve. A board member near the end of the table quietly slid her chair backward, as if putting physical distance between herself and Darlene might somehow protect her from whatever was coming next. And another began scrolling through his own phone, searching his email for any message that might connect his name to decisions he suddenly wished he had questioned earlier. Graham laid out calmly and without embellishment that federal authorities were examining potential wire fraud, bank fraud, forged lien documentation, elder financial exploitation involving multiple victims, possible collusion in wrongful foreclosures, and suspicious financial transfers between the association and companies with direct personal ties to sitting board members. Darlene tried to regain her footing by asking whether he had a warrant, and Graham admitted honestly that he did not. Not yet. Emboldened, Darlene ordered him out of what she called her office, and Graham obliged without argument, rising and walking calmly toward the door, as if the meeting had concluded exactly as he intended. Darlene believed for a moment that she had won, watching him leave with a satisfied smirk, unaware that the true consequences of the conversation were only beginning to unfold behind her. Within minutes, Marissa pulled Darlene aside into an empty hallway, her voice low and urgent, reminding her that she had just admitted in front of multiple witnesses to personally ordering the confinement of an elderly homeowner outside her own property. Darlene shrugged the concern away, but Marissa pressed further, asking directly about Voss Property Holdings and why her name kept appearing attached to foreclosed properties the association itself had pushed into distress. Darlene went quiet, because she had never disclosed that financial interest to her own attorney, and for the first time, a crack opened in what had always appeared to be a united front. Outside the clubhouse, Nora informed Graham that they now had sufficient grounds to accelerate a subpoena request through the appropriate channels, and Graham was careful to state clearly and on the record that he would recuse himself from any direct decision-making tied to his own parents, leaving oversight entirely to the deputy director and the United States Attorney's Office. That single decision mattered enormously because it meant Graham was not weaponizing his position for personal revenge. He was simply the one who had noticed the pattern first and made certain the proper institutions took it from there. Nora reminded him gently that recusal would slow certain parts of the process down, since he would not be permitted to review evidence directly tied to his parents' property, and Graham told her that was exactly the point, because the moment the case became about protecting his own family rather than protecting the truth, it would stop being worth pursuing at all. He spent that first night back in his childhood bedroom, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead just as it had when he was a boy, listening to his mother move quietly through the kitchen downstairs. Unable to sleep the way people rarely can when the walls around them suddenly feel less safe than they used to. As the investigation widened over the following days, a disturbing shape began to emerge from the paperwork. Darlene had been selective in choosing her targets, favoring homeowners who were elderly, who lived with few relatives nearby, and who happened to own land in strategically valuable locations along the community's edges. Once selected, those families followed an almost identical sequence, beginning with repeated citations for minor landscaping infractions, followed by escalating late fees, followed by legal charges tacked onto the balance, followed by formal liens, followed in some cases by selective service disruptions, all designed to pressure the homeowner into either selling outright or signing over an easement. Of the 37 liens filed over 2 years, investigators found that at least 14 carried signs of altered filing dates, small inconsistencies that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not specifically looking for them. 11 of those homes had already gone through foreclosure, and 7 of the resulting sales traced back to limited liability companies connected either directly to Darlene or to close associates on the board. But the most damaging discovery involved the water system itself. Investigators confirmed that the association had been charging residents so-called infrastructure fees on a pipeline it never legally owned. Since the line ran through a county utility easement established back in 1988, decades before Silver Creek Estates was even built. Over 6 years, the association had collected more than $640,000 in fees. It had no legal right to charge, and remarkably, Warren himself had been the engineer who signed off on the original blueprints for that very pipeline. He still kept a copy of those decades-old plans locked inside a small safe in his study, unaware until that week that the paper he had preserved out of simple habit would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in a federal fraud case. Darlene had no idea the documents even existed, and when Warren handed them over to investigators, a single faded engineering drawing became the thread that started unraveling an entire financial scheme built on manufactured emergencies and manufactured debt. Nora's team spent 2 full days cross-referencing every lien against county tax records, building a timeline that showed a disturbing rhythm to the harassment, with new citations almost always appearing within days of a homeowner, rejecting an early buyout offer, as though the fines themselves functioned less as enforcement and more as punishment for saying no. One elderly widow, interviewed separately by a junior agent, described receiving 17 citations in a single year for infractions she had never been able to identify, ranging from an improperly trimmed hedge to a mailbox positioned at what the notice called an unapproved angle. Another homeowner, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Silver Creek since it was first built, broke down while describing how quickly her modest savings had disappeared into legal fees. She never fully understood money. She had assumed for years was simply the unavoidable cost of living somewhere nice. Realizing how quickly the ground beneath her was shifting, Darlene chose not to retreat but to fight back publicly. She called an emergency community meeting and stood before more than 200 residents, framing herself as the true victim of the situation, claiming that the Whitaker family was attempting to weaponize the federal government to seize control of the entire neighborhood for themselves. She went further, suggesting that Graham was secretly pressuring the association to hand his parents free land, and for a moment, a portion of the crowd seemed to waver, unsure who to believe. To strengthen her case, Darlene produced what she claimed was an email from Graham instructing the sheriff's department to forcibly remove association leadership from their positions. When Nora examined the message's underlying data, the forgery became obvious almost immediately, since the email had actually originated from servers belonging to a marketing firm that had been receiving regular payments from the association itself. Fabricating evidence in an attempt to obstruct an active federal investigation only deepened the legal trouble closing in around Darlene, though she did not yet grasp how thoroughly her actions were being documented. Around the same time, Travis attempted to quietly dispose of internal records and security footage, captured him loading several boxes of documents into his personal vehicle at 2:13 in the morning, moving with the hurried, guilty posture of a man who, believed no one was watching. Federal agents were watching, and rather than intervening immediately, they chose to follow the boxes to their destination, wanting to understand exactly where the evidence was being hidden before making any arrests. Travis drove the material to a small storage facility on the edge of town, a unit that turned out to contain more than a decade of association records along with a personal laptop he had apparently forgotten to wipe. On that laptop, investigators found a detailed spreadsheet listing target properties, pressure levels applied to each homeowner, projected foreclosure value, and the specific acquisition entity assigned to absorb each parcel once the pressure campaign succeeded. Warren Whitaker's name appeared on line 4 of that spreadsheet, and beside it in bold lettering sat a single note that removed any lingering ambiguity about intent West Access Resort project priority. There was no longer any question that cutting the water had never been about unpaid fines at all. It had always been a deliberate tool of coercion aimed squarely at forcing an elderly couple off land the association desperately wanted for itself. When agents later matched the spreadsheet's pressure levels against the actual sequence of enforcement actions taken against each household, the correlation was almost mechanical, as though Darlene had run her entire community like a business plan, rather than a neighborhood treating every resident's home as a line item to be optimized rather than a life to be respected. Even with agents closing in around her, Darlene continued conducting association business as though nothing had changed, calling a regular board meeting with the stated goal of passing an emergency resolution granting herself authority to destroy what she called obsolete records. Marissa refused outright to sign off on the measure, and when Darlene threatened to have her removed from her position for insubordination, Marissa simply stood her ground, unwilling to put her name on anything else connected to the scheme. At exactly 7:02 that evening, the clubhouse doors opened and Sheriff Caleb Mercer walked in first, followed closely by Special Agent Nora Bellamy, with Graham entering last. This time there were no unmarked vehicles trying to remain discreet. The parking lot outside was filled with more than a dozen federal and county vehicles, their presence impossible to mistake for anything but what it was. Darlene rose immediately, declaring that this was private property and that they had no right to be there, but Nora simply held out a signed warrant and told her plainly that it was no longer a matter open to her objection. Teams of agents split quickly to secure digital evidence, financial ledgers, property files, office servers, and personal devices covered under the scope of the warrant, moving with practiced efficiency through a building that had until minutes earlier felt entirely under Darlene's control. Travis attempted to slip out through a rear exit, only to find 2 deputies already stationed there waiting for him. Darlene screamed that Graham was orchestrating a personal act of revenge, but Graham remained at the far end of the room, deliberately keeping his distance, allowing Nora and the accompanying agents to lead every part of the operation. That single choice mattered more than anyone in the room realized at the time, because it stripped away any argument that a federal director had misused his authority to settle a grudge on behalf of his own family. When agents finally pried open the safe hidden behind a bookshelf in Darlene's private office, they found dozens of original property deeds inside several bearing signatures that experts would later confirm had been forged. Tucked among the papers was an envelope containing records of a payment from the resort developer, $1.8 million, labeled simply as a consulting fee made out to an entity called DV Strategic Holdings, a company owned entirely by Darlene herself. Agents photographed each document in place before removing it, cataloging everything with the same careful precision. Warren had once used to draft the pipeline blueprints that started this entire unraveling, and by midnight, the clubhouse, that had spent years functioning as the center of Darlene's authority, had been reduced to little more than a crime scene, with folding chairs still arranged for a meeting that would never resume. Many watching this story unfold assumed that Darlene's arrest would mark its natural conclusion, but the truth stretched far beyond one woman's greed. As federal investigators followed the money further, they discovered that Darlene had never been operating alone, and that she was not even the most powerful figure benefiting from the scheme. A deputy assessor within the county government had quietly helped adjust property valuations to make the seized parcels more attractive to buyers. A loan officer at a regional bank had processed multiple foreclosures under conditions that violated standard lending protocols. And the resort developer himself had been funding Darlene's pressure campaign from the very beginning, hoping to secure enough contiguous land to complete a project valued at roughly $90 million. Darlene had believed she was the one pulling the strings, when in reality she was simply the most visible piece of a machine, involving several people willing to exploit vulnerable homeowners for their own financial gain. Nora called Graham with an update that reframed the entire case, revealing a name on the developer's payment ledger that no one had expected to find: a longtime member of the County Planning Commission. Someone whose quiet influence explained why so many earlier complaints against the association had mysteriously gone nowhere. What had started as a single water valve dispute had transformed into a sprawling public corruption investigation touching multiple layers of local government. During her final interview with investigators, Marissa chose to fully cooperate, handing over a series of internal messages that removed any remaining doubt about intent, including one in which Darlene had written that once the Whitakers signed the Western Road access would finally belong to them, and another stating plainly that without water, without access, and without patience, the family would eventually surrender. Marissa admitted quietly, and without excuse, that she had spent years telling herself she was simply doing her job, drafting the paperwork Darlene asked for, without asking too many questions about where the money ultimately went. And she said that watching an elderly woman locked outside her own gate was the first moment she could no longer pretend not to know what kind of organization she had been protecting. The final morning of the ordeal began quietly at the Whitaker property, with a county utility crew arriving not to disconnect anything, but to remove every piece of equipment the association had illegally installed on the line. The main valve was reopened, and after days without service, water began flowing steadily through the pipes once more. Evelyn walked into her kitchen, turned the faucet handle, and watched clean water pour into the sink, a simple, unremarkable motion that somehow carried the full weight of everything the family had endured. There was no triumphant music playing in that moment, no dramatic gesture, only the small, steady sound of water running freely through a home that had nearly been taken from her. Warren watched his son standing near the doorway and told him quietly that he hadn't needed to go through all of this just for his parents' sake. Graham answered simply that he had not done it only for them. He looked out toward the small cluster of neighbors gathered near the sidewalk families, who had endured their own quiet version of the same pressure campaign, and told his father that he had done it because so many others had been forced through the exact same ordeal, often with no one powerful enough in their corner to notice. In the months that followed, Darlene faced federal charges including fraud, conspiracy filing, forged property records, and obstruction of a federal investigation, alongside several other individuals implicated in the broader scheme. The county planning commissioner resigned within days of the story becoming public, and the bank employee who had processed the irregular foreclosures was placed on administrative leave pending her own separate hearing. A quiet unraveling that spread outward from Silver Creek into offices that had nothing to do with homeowners associations at all. The resort developers project was suspended indefinitely, while prosecutors determined how much of the funding had passed through accounts connected to the fraud, leaving a stretch of undeveloped land sitting quiet and untouched at the edge of the community, the very ground so many people had been pressured to give up, now serving no purpose for anyone at all. Travis eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, though he still faced consequences for his direct role in detaining an elderly resident and destroying evidence. Every foreclosure connected to the fraudulent lien scheme was placed under judicial review, and several transactions were formally frozen pending further investigation. The association itself was placed under temporary court supervision, and the illegal water charges collected over 6 years were slowly returned to residents through a court-ordered restitution process. Travis, for his part, spent the weeks awaiting sentencing, helping investigators identify additional victims whose files had never made it into the original spreadsheet, a small act of cooperation that did little to undo what he had already done, but seemed at least to Caleb like the first honest thing the man had said since the whole affair began. Several of the 11 families who had lost their homes through wrongful foreclosure were eventually able to reclaim their properties once the fraudulent liens were formally voided by the court, though for a few of them the process took the fortale into his end. Better part of a year filled with hearings and paperwork that never fully erased the exhaustion of having been pushed out in the first place. One family returned to find their old house had been left mostly untouched, the new owners having done little more than change the locks, and the mother of that household told a local reporter that walking back through her own front door felt less like a victory and more like waking up from a very long, very bad dream. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome came several months later when Silver Creek Estates held new elections for its governing board. A number of residents approached Evelyn directly and asked her to run for president, believing she was exactly the kind of steady, principled leader the community needed after everything that had happened. She declined without hesitation, telling them gently that after what this neighborhood had just survived, the last thing it needed was another person hungry for control. Instead, she proposed a series of reforms to the community's governing charter, and each one passed with overwhelming support from her neighbors. Under the new rules, no single association president could unilaterally order a utility disconnection under any circumstance. Every major lien filed against a homeowner would require independent review before it could take effect. Financial records belonging to the board would be made fully accessible to any resident who wished to inspect them. Private security personnel were expressly forbidden from detaining or restraining residents under any pretense, and any board member holding a financial interest in a property connected to association business would be legally required to disclose that conflict publicly before any vote could be taken. The community held a small gathering. The week the new charter was formally adopted, nothing elaborate, just folding tables set up near the clubhouse and pitchers of lemonade sweating in the afternoon heat. But for many of the residents who had spent the past 2 years quietly afraid of citations and liens, they didn't understand. It felt like the first time Silver Creek had ever actually resembled the peaceful community it was supposed to be. Caleb stopped by for an hour, no longer wearing the guarded expression he had carried the day. Darlene threatened him over tax revenue, and he told Warren privately that this was the kind of ending he rarely got to see in his line of work, one where the people doing the harm actually answered for it, instead of simply moving on to another town. Marissa also attended, standing a little apart from the crowd, and when Evelyn approached her with a plate of food, the two women spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Not about lawsuits or liens, but about how strange it was that an entire community could exist for years without anyone noticing what was happening just beneath its surface. In the weeks after the arrests, Graham found himself fielding calls from journalists eager to build a story around the dramatic image of an FBI director storming into a homeowners meeting to rescue his own mother, and every time he declined, insisting the real story belonged to the 37 families who had endured this treatment long before anyone in Washington ever heard the name Silver Creek. He did agree to one brief statement issued through the Bureau's press office, careful and measured, noting simply that federal law protected every citizen equally, regardless of age, and that no local authority, however small, was permitted to operate outside the reach of that protection. Warren read the statement twice at the kitchen table, then folded the paper and set it aside without comment. The kind of quiet pride that never needed to be spoken aloud in a family that had always shown its affection through action rather than words. Weeks later, as Graham prepared to return to Washington, he stood beside the front gate of his parents' property one final time before leaving. The electronic lock Darlene had installed was long gone, and Warren was in the process of replacing it with a simple wooden gate, the kind that had stood there for decades before any of this began. Evelyn walked out carrying a glass of water and handed it to her son without a word. She asked him if he knew what the strangest part of the whole ordeal had been, and Graham looked at her waiting. Darlene had believed that cutting off their water would be the very thing that forced the family to give up and leave, when in truth it was the exact thing that had brought her son racing home. Evelyn raised the glass slightly, almost like a toast, and told him that all Darlene ever had to do was leave the water running. Graham laughed quietly at the simple, almost absurd truth of it, the tension of the past weeks finally easing from his shoulders. In the distance, an unmarked federal vehicle rolled slowly past the entrance to Silver Creek Estates, continuing its work as investigators kept unraveling the wider case still unfolding beneath the surface of a community that had once looked from the outside like nothing more than a quiet, well-manicured suburb. Darlene Voss had set out to seize 14 acres of land by locking an elderly woman outside her own home, believing that fear and exhaustion would eventually break the Whitaker family into submission. Instead, that single decision opened the door to a federal investigation that dismantled her entire empire piece by piece until nothing remained of the power she had spent years quietly building on the suffering of her own neighbors.